Hello there, how are you tonight? Imagine a story that feels quiet on the surface, but carries something much deeper underneath, a connection that doesn't quite make sense, and yet, somehow, it still happens. Two very different worlds, one shaped by conflict, strength, and intensity, the other by beauty, desire, and something far more gentle. And when these two forces meet, it isn't simple, it isn't easy, and it certainly isn't without consequences, because some relationships aren't built on comfort, but on tension, on curiosity, and on emotions that don't always follow the rules at first. It may seem small, almost unnoticeable, just a few quiet moments, a glance, a presence. Something difficult to explain, but over time, those small moments begin to grow, and in a world where nothing truly stays hidden, even the quietest connection can begin to draw attention. There are always eyes watching, always whispers forming, and always a sense that something is slowly unfolding. Before we step further into this story, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these calm journeys, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always a little comforting seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's gently explore the strange and complicated story of Ares and Aphrodite. There are stories that begin with thunder, with loud declarations, with moments that feel impossible to ignore, and then there are stories like this one, the kind that begin quietly, so quietly that no one notices at first, far above the world of mortals, beyond the shifting winds and soft glow of distant horizons. There existed a place untouched by ordinary time, a realm where everything felt still, yet alive in its own quiet way. Here, nothing truly rushed, moments stretched longer than they should, and emotions lingered in ways that felt almost deliberate. It was in this stillness, in this calm and watchful world, that something unusual began to take shape, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, almost hesitantly. At first, there was no name for it, no clear beginning, just a subtle shift, like the air changing before a storm that no one could yet see. There were gatherings, as there always were, places where figures moved gracefully through open halls of light and shadow, where voices remained soft, yet carried meaning far beyond their volume, and within these spaces, paths would occasionally cross. Not in a way that demanded attention, but just enough to be remembered, a passing moment, a presence felt rather than acknowledged. It was the kind of thing most would ignore, and yet something about it lingered. There was a contrast, subtle, but undeniable. One presence carried a weight, something steady, grounded, almost heavy in its silence. The other felt lighter, softer, yet impossible to overlook, not because it demanded attention, but because it naturally drew it. Still, nothing happened, not really. No words exchanged that mattered, no gestures that would raise suspicion, just moments, quiet, fleeting moments, and yet, those moments had a way of returning, again and again, almost as if something unseen was guiding them closer, not forcefully, but gently. With quiet persistence, time passed. Though time here was never quite easy to measure, and with it came familiarity, not the kind built through conversation, but the kind formed through repeated presence, through noticing, without trying to, through remembering, without intending to. There was no reason for it, no clear explanation, and perhaps that was what made it so unusual, because in a place where everything had order, where every connection had a purpose, this one didn't seem to follow any known path. It simply existed, and that alone made it fragile, because things without structure, without definition, are often the easiest to overlook, but also the easiest to disrupt. Still, nothing was questioned, not yet. The world around them remained unchanged, calm, steady, predictable in its quiet rhythm, but beneath that calm, something had already begun to move, something small, but persistent, like the first ripple in still water, easy to miss unless you were looking closely, and no one was looking, or at least, no one seemed to be. For now, it remained what it had always been. Unnoticed, undefined, and quietly inevitable. If you linger just a little longer in that quiet space, you begin to notice something subtle, not in what is happening, but in what isn't, because some connections don't begin with closeness, they begin with distance, not just physical distance, but something deeper, something shaped by nature, by purpose, by identity, and in this story, that distance is impossible to ignore. On one side, there exists a presence defined by weight, not loud, not chaotic in this moment, but steady, grounded, unyielding. This is the world shaped by ours, a world where emotion is often sharpened into something practical, where hesitation rarely has a place, and where movement carries intention. Even in stillness, it is not always loud, as one might expect. In fact, there are moments where it becomes very quiet, a quiet that feels heavy, as though something is always waiting just beneath the surface. There is discipline here, but it is not gentle. It is formed through pressure, through expectation, through a constant awareness of strength. Even when nothing is happening, there is always the sense that something could. That is what defines it, not chaos, but readiness. And then, on the other side, there is something entirely different, a presence that doesn't press down, but instead seems to drift, soft, but not weak, gentle, but never insignificant. This is the world shaped by Aphrodite, where emotion is not restrained, but allowed to move, to expand, to exist without resistance. Here, things unfold slowly, not because they must, but because they are meant to be experienced. There is a lightness in this space, a kind of warmth that doesn't demand attention, but quietly invites it. Nothing feels forced, nothing feels urgent. Even time itself seems softer here, less structured, less defined. Where one world holds tension like a tightly drawn line, this one allows it to dissolve gently, without effort. And between these two worlds, there is no natural bridge, no reason for overlap. They are not opposites in conflict, but they are not meant to meet either. They exist separately, balanced in their own way, complete without needing the other, at least. That is how it has always been, but something has already begun to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would point to and question, but in the smallest details, in the way certain moments linger just a little longer than they should, in the way awareness begins to form, without invitation. It happens slowly, so slowly, that it almost feels like nothing at all. There are places where these worlds come close, just for a moment, shared spaces that belong fully to neither side, open halls, quiet courtyards, areas where presence overlaps without intention. And it is here, in these undefined spaces, that the distance between them feels slightly less certain, not gone, never gone, but thinner. A figure stands still, carrying that quiet, grounded weight, not observing directly, but aware, always aware. And somewhere not far away, another presence moves with ease, unhurried, untouched by the same sense of gravity. There is no interaction, no acknowledgement, but something passes between them anyway. Not a look, not a gesture, just awareness. It is fleeting, gone almost as soon as it appears, and yet, it leaves something behind. Not confusion, not clarity either, just a subtle recognition that something exists where nothing should. The world itself does not react, it continues as it always has, calm, balanced, unquestioning. But beneath that balance, something has changed, even if no one has named it yet, because when two worlds are not meant to touch, even the smallest point of contact can begin to shift everything around it, quietly, gradually, without permission. And perhaps the strangest part of all is that neither of them fully understands it yet, not the weight that pauses for just a moment longer than usual, nor the lightness that lingers where it normally would not. They simply continue, unaware, or perhaps only partially aware, that something has begun, something that does not belong to either world, something that exists only in the space between them, and spaces like that rarely stay unnoticed for long. If you remain in this space a little longer, you begin to understand that what we are witnessing is not simply a meeting of two figures, but a meeting of natures, and to understand what is beginning to form, we must first understand one of those natures more closely. There is a common assumption that strength always announces itself loudly, that it arrives with noise, with movement, with something impossible to ignore, but that isn't always true. Sometimes, strength is quiet. Not peaceful, but controlled, not soft, but contained. This is where we find ours, not in motion, not in conflict, but in stillness. There is something unusual about that stillness. It doesn't feel empty, it feels deliberate, as though every moment of quiet carries something beneath it, something that doesn't need to be seen to be present. It is the kind of stillness that suggests readiness, not rest. His presence is not difficult to notice, but it is also not something that seeks attention. It exists firmly, undeniably, without needing to prove itself. There is a weight to it, not just physical, but something deeper, a kind of internal gravity. It shapes the space around him, even when nothing is happening, even when no one is watching. There is always the sense that something could shift at any moment, not unpredictably, but precisely. And yet, this nature is often misunderstood, because from a distance, it appears simple, defined, clear, but up close, it becomes something else entirely. There is structure here. Yes, but it is not rigid, it adapts. Quietly, it observes, it waits, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. There are moments, rare moments, where that awareness turns inward, where the stillness is not about the world around him, but something within, and in those moments, something shifts, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, because beneath all that control, there is something less defined, not weakness, not uncertainty, but something unexamined. It does not surface often, and when it does not stay long. It moves like a shadow, passing briefly through the edges of awareness, before disappearing again into stillness. This is not a nature that invites disruption. It is not a presence that seeks change. Everything about it is built on consistency, on understanding its place, on remaining within the boundaries that have always existed, and yet, something has already begun to move. At first, it is easy to dismiss a slight pause where there would normally be none, a moment of attention, directed where it does not need to be. It does not feel significant, it does not feel important, but it happens again, and then again, not frequently, not enough to raise concern, but enough to be noticed. There is no clear reason for it, no defined cause, just a quiet shift in where awareness chooses to rest, and that is where the nature begins to change, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else would see, but internally, subtly, because awareness, once redirected, does not always return to where it was before. There is something unfamiliar in that, not uncomfortable, but not entirely understood either. It does not disrupt the stillness, it exists within it, blending into it, becoming part of it, without fully belonging, and perhaps that is what makes it dangerous, not because it is intense, not because it is overwhelming, but because it is quiet. Quiet things are easy to ignore, easy to overlook, until they are no longer small. And this is still very small. Just a moment here, a pause there, a shift in attention that lasts only a second longer than it should, but even the most controlled nature is not entirely immune to something it does not yet understand, and somewhere in that quiet awareness, a question has begun to form, not spoken, not fully realized, but present. Why does this feel different? There is no answer, not yet, only stillness, only control, only the familiar weight of a nature that has always known itself, but now, with something new resting quietly inside it, something that does not follow its rules, and whether it is acknowledged or not, that changes everything. If you remain here, in this quiet unfolding, you may begin to notice that not all presence feels the same. Some carry weight, others carry something entirely different. Where one nature holds itself with quiet restraint, another moves without needing to hold at all, not because it lacks depth, but because it expresses it differently. To understand what is forming between these two worlds, we must now turn our attention, gently, toward the other presence, toward Aphrodite. There is a certain kind of stillness that feels heavy, and then there is another kind that feels almost like movement, even when nothing is happening. This is where her presence exists. Not fixed, not anchored, but flowing, softly, continuously, as though it does not need to remain in one place to be felt. It is not something that demands attention, it does not arrive with intensity, it simply becomes noticeable. At first, you may not even realize it is there, a shift in the air, a subtle warmth, something that changes the feeling of a space, without changing anything you can clearly see. And yet, once it is noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore. There is a lightness to it, not fragile, not fleeting, but unburdened. Where other presences carry intention like weight, this one carries it like a quiet invitation, not asking, not expecting, simply existing in a way that allows others to notice, if they choose to. There is no urgency here, no sense of needing to act or to become something more. Everything feels complete, even in motion, and yet, within that calm, there is depth, not immediately visible, not something that reveals itself all at once, but something that unfolds slowly, layer by layer. If one takes the time to remain, there are moments when this presence lingers, just a little longer than expected. Moments where movement slows, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Awareness of something, just beyond reach. It is subtle, so subtle, that it could easily be mistaken for nothing at all, a passing thought, a brief pause, a feeling without a clear source. But much like the quiet shifts we have already seen, it does not disappear entirely, it returns, not stronger, not clearer, just present. There is something unusual about that, because this is not a nature that typically lingers on what it cannot define. It moves, it flows, it does not remain where understanding is uncertain. And yet, now, it does, not completely, not enough to disrupt its calm, but enough to create a moment of stillness within the flow, and within that stillness, something begins to form, not a thought, not a decision, but a quiet awareness of another presence, not distant, not entirely separate, but not fully understood either. There is no tension in this awareness, no resistance, only curiosity, a gentle recognition that something exists beyond what is familiar, and for a presence that has always moved freely, without needing to question its direction, that recognition is new. It does not change the movement, it does not alter the calm, but it adds something. Something small, but undeniable, a reason to pause, and in that pause, the space between two worlds becomes just slightly more defined, not through action, not through connection, but through awareness, because now, it is no longer only one side that has begun to notice, and when awareness exists on both sides, what once felt like distance, begins to feel different, not closer, not yet, but no longer entirely separate, and that is where things begin to change. There is a moment, in nearly every story like this, a moment that feels almost ordinary, not dramatic, not sudden, but quietly important. It is the moment when distance begins to lose its certainty. Until now, everything has remained subtle, awareness. Without direction, presence. Without interaction, two worlds, moving close enough to be felt, but never close enough to truly meet. And yet, there are places where separation becomes less clear, not because those places belong to both, but because they belong fully to neither. Open spaces, unclaimed moments, quiet passages where structure softens, and boundaries are not as firmly held. It is here, in these undefined spaces, That something begins to happen, not intentionally, not by design, but simply because it can. A quiet courtyard, bathed in the soft light of late afternoon, marble surfaces worn gently by the fading sun, long shadows stretching across the still ground. Nothing moves quickly here, nothing demands attention, and yet, something shifts, a presence enters, not abruptly, not with purpose that can be seen, just arrival. The quiet, grounded stillness of Ars settles into the space, not claiming it, not changing it, but becoming part of it. Moments pass, silent, unremarkable, and then, another presence. Soft, unhurried, almost as if it has always belonged here, Aphrodite moves into the same space, without disruption. There is no immediate recognition, no sudden shift, because for a brief moment, it is simply coincidence, two presences, occupying the same place, nothing more. But then, something changes, not in movement, not in sound, but in awareness. It happens quietly, so quietly, that it could easily be missed, a stillness that becomes slightly more focused, a movement that slows just enough to notice something unfamiliar. There is no direct gaze, no clear acknowledgement, and yet, the space itself feels different, as though something invisible has settled between them. Not tension, not connection, just something, a presence. Within the presence, time does not stop, but it feels stretched, each second lingering just a little longer than expected. There is no need to act, no reason to speak, and yet, neither presence leaves. That is the first change, because normally, these moments would pass quickly, without memory, but this one stays, not because it must, but because something allows it to. A quiet shift in attention. The grounded stillness becomes aware, not of a threat, not of a purpose, but of something softer, and the flowing presence becomes aware, not of curiosity alone, but of something more defined. Still gentle, still calm, but no longer entirely without focus. The distance between them does not disappear, it remains. But now, it is no longer unnoticed. That changes everything, because once something is noticed, it cannot return to being invisible. Moments pass, still quiet, still without action, and yet, the space feels full, not crowded, not heavy, but shared. Eventually, movement returns, not suddenly, not urgently, just naturally. One presence shifts, as though the moment has reached its quiet end. The other follows, not in direction, but in awareness, and then, they leave, not together, not connected, but not entirely separate either, because something remains, not in the space, but within it, a memory, without form, a moment, without explanation, and perhaps, without meaning, at least for now. But moments like this rarely stay without meaning for long. There are moments in every unfolding story that do not announce themselves, they do not arrive with clarity, they do not ask to be understood, they simply happen, and afterward, nothing feels entirely the same. This is one of those moments. At first, it appears insignificant, a shared space, a passing awareness, a silence that lasts just a little longer than usual, nothing more, at least not on the surface. But beneath that surface, something begins to shift, quietly, carefully, almost as if the world itself is unsure whether to acknowledge it, because what is forming here does not follow expectation, it does not follow structure, it does not belong to any known pattern. It simply exists, and that alone makes it difficult, not because it is loud, not because it is disruptive, but because it does not make sense in the world it exists within. A presence shaped by weight, and a presence shaped by movement, briefly sharing the same awareness. It should have meant nothing, it should have dissolved instantly, like countless other passing moments, but it does not. Instead, it lingers, not in space, but in memory, in awareness, in something that cannot yet be named. There is no conversation, no exchange, no deliberate acknowledgement, and yet, something is understood. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to leave a trace that does not fade as quickly as it should. In one presence, there is a pause that feels unfamiliar, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but attention. Directed somewhere it has never naturally gone before. In the other, there is a stillness that feels slightly more focused than before, not changed, not disrupted, but subtly adjusted, as though something in the atmosphere has shifted position. Neither understands why, and neither attempts to define it, and yet, both remain aware of it. That is what makes it difficult, not the encounter itself, but the fact that it leaves something behind. Without explanation. A connection that should not have formed, not because it is forbidden, not because it is impossible, but because it has no place in the structure of how things are meant to be, and still, it forms anyway, not as a bond, not as a decision, not as something defined, but as something quieter, more uncertain, more fragile, something that exists only in the space between recognition and understanding, and that space is not stable. It shifts easily, it changes without warning. It does not promise continuity, and yet, it remains, even after the moment ends, even after distance returns, even after nothing appears to have changed, something continues, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, in ways that are not yet understood. There is no name for it, no explanation that fits cleanly. Only a lingering awareness that something crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, not violently, not intentionally, but quietly, naturally, as if it had always been possible, and simply had not happened until now. And that realization is the most unsettling part, because if something can happen once, without reason, then it can happen again, and again, not in the same way, not with the same clarity. But enough to matter, enough to change how distance feels. Enough to make silence feel less empty than before, and so, what should have remained separate, does not anymore. It does not become a connection yet, not fully, but it becomes something else, something in between, something undefined, something quietly persistent, and in a world built on clarity and order, undefined things are never harmless for long. There are changes in a story like this that do not announce themselves, they do not arrive with clarity, they do not demand attention, they simply settle in, and once they settle, they are difficult to ignore. After the moment that should not have existed, something remains, not a bond, not a connection in any defined sense, but a presence, a shared awareness, that neither side fully understands. At first, it seems like nothing, a coincidence remembered only in passing, a moment that dissolves easily into routine, but then, it happens again, not in the same way, not in the same place, but in feeling, a quiet return of awareness, as though something unseen has gently turned its attention back. There is no conversation, no intention, no decision, only recognition, without acknowledgement, and in that recognition, something begins to soften, not the worlds themselves, not the structures around them, but the space between, a space that once felt distant, now feels slightly less absolute. It is in this softened distance that the first quiet moments begin, not moments of action, not moments of change, but moments of simply being near, not physically close, not visibly connected, but aware of each other, in a way that cannot easily be dismissed anymore. In one of these moments, Ares stands within a quiet stone corridor, still, unmoving, but his awareness is not entirely on the space around him. It drifts, briefly, without direction, and somewhere else, Aphrodite moves slowly through a garden path where light filters through olive branches. Her presence remains calm, but something in her attention shifts, just slightly, not toward a place, not toward an event, but toward something unspoken. Neither of them stops, neither of them turns fully, and yet, something is acknowledged, silently, without confirmation. These are the first quiet moments. They do not interrupt time, they do not alter reality, but they exist within it now, like faint impressions left on stone, slowly becoming part of the surface. There is no explanation for them, no reason that can be clearly defined, and yet, they continue to appear, not frequently, not predictably, but enough to become noticeable, enough to be remembered. And perhaps that is where the change truly begins, not in interaction, not in understanding, but in repetition, because something that returns, even gently, even without intention, begins to matter. There is a quiet adjustment happening now, not in how they move, not in how they exist, but in how they notice. Awareness that once passed through quickly, now lingers, just a little longer. A glance that was never taken, now almost feels as though it could have been. A moment of silence, now slightly heavier than before. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just subtle shifts, too small to name, but too consistent to ignore. And in these shifts, something begins to take shape, not yet a connection, not yet a story between them, but something that could become one, if it continues, if it deepens, if it is not interrupted by the world that surrounds it, because worlds like these do not easily allow quiet things to grow unchecked, and yet, it is already growing. Quietly, naturally, without asking permission, and that is what makes it real. There are things in the world that do not announce themselves as they grow. They do not become visible all at once. They do not shift the world in a single moment. Instead, they remain hidden, not because they are forbidden, not because they are impossible, but because they are still undefined. What began as awareness, what became repetition, what turned into quiet moments of shared presence, now settles into something more delicate, more careful, something that exists only when it is not being looked at directly. There is no declaration, no agreement, no decision that marks a beginning, only silence that begins to carry more meaning than before. In this silence, something forms between them, not a connection in the way stories usually define it, not a bond that can be named or explained, but something softer, something more fragile, a pattern of moments that should not be noticed, yet somehow are, and because they are noticed, they cannot remain the same. There is a shift now in how presence is carried, not openly, not visibly, but carefully, quietly, as though even awareness itself must be controlled. When ours moves through still corridors or empty courtyards, there is a subtle restraint that was not there before, not hesitation, not fear, but awareness of being aware. And when Aphrodite passes through light-filled spaces, there is a similar quietness, not less presence, but more attention to how presence exists. It is not something spoken, it is not something acknowledged, but it is there because something unspoken between two presences changes how they exist within the same world, even if no one else sees it. There are places where paths almost cross now, not by design, not by planning, but by the natural rhythm of movement through shared spaces. And in those almost moments, something is always held back, a glance that does not fully turn, a pause that does not become action, a presence that does not extend beyond itself. It is restraint, but not imposed restraint, chosen restraint, and that makes it more complex, because what is chosen can also be unchosen, but neither of them moves in that direction, not yet. Instead, what forms is something quieter, something more subtle than interaction, a hidden rhythm, a pattern of near encounters that never fully arrive, and yet never fully disappear. It becomes something that exists only in memory, only in awareness, only in the space between what is seen and what is felt, and like all things that remain unseen, it begins to feel more real than what is visible. There is no name for this kind of existence, no structure that defines it, only repetition, and silence, and the growing awareness that something is being preserved, not openly, not publicly, but carefully, as if even reality itself must not disturb it too quickly. But secrets, even quiet ones, have a way of creating pressure, not immediately, not loudly, but slowly, over time, because anything that exists, without being acknowledged, must eventually find a way to be noticed, and the longer it remains hidden, the more it begins to matter. Not as a fact, not as a story, but as something felt, something carried, something quietly understood, even without words. And so, what began as nothing more than awareness, now becomes something that requires care, not protection, not fear, but attention, because hidden things do not stay hidden forever. There comes a point in every hidden thing when hiding itself begins to change, not suddenly, not loudly, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. What once felt effortless begins to feel aware of itself, because nothing that exists in silence can remain untouched by attention forever. The moments have not changed, not in form, not in appearance, but something within them has a subtle awareness that they are no longer entirely alone, that they might, at some point, be noticed, and that possibility alone is enough to alter everything. There is a difference between being unseen and being almost seen. Unseen things are free, unconsidered, unmeasured, but almost seen things begin to carry weight, they become careful, they become measured, they begin to exist differently. In the quiet spaces where ours moves, there is now a subtle shift in presence, not hesitation, not fear, but precision, as though even stillness must now be placed carefully. And in the softer spaces where Aphrodite exists, there is a similar awareness, not withdrawal, not avoidance, but a quiet adjustment in how presence flows through space. It is not visible to others, not clearly, not directly, but it is there. Because being near something that should not be seen changes how nearness feels. There are now moments where distance is chosen more carefully, where paths that might naturally cross are subtly altered, not avoided entirely, but softened, redirected. And yet, despite all of this care, nothing truly stops, because what has already formed does not dissolve easily. It simply becomes more aware of itself, and awareness is never neutral. It changes the rhythm of even the smallest actions, a pause that lasts a fraction longer, a movement that becomes slightly more deliberate, a presence that feels contained, not because it must be hidden, but because it might be seen, and that possibility introduces something new, a tension that is not loud, but persistent, not fear, not urgency, but consideration, the kind that lingers in silence, the kind that shapes decisions before they are made. And in this space, between action and restraint, something delicate begins to form, a boundary that does not exist in law or rule, but in awareness, a shared understanding, without agreement, that some things are safer when unobserved, but safety and desire for continuation do not always move in the same direction, and that is where the fragility lies, because what is carefully hidden is also what is most sensitive to discovery. A single moment, a single unintended glance, a single coincidence of timing, and everything could shift, not collapse, not end, but change irrevocably. And perhaps that is what makes it so quietly powerful, because now every moment carries two possibilities: to remain unseen or to become known. And neither possibility feels simple anymore, not in this world, not in this silence, not between these two presences that were never meant to be noticed together, and yet they are. Change does not always begin where it is expected. It does not always begin with action or with choice. Sometimes it begins in the space around things, not in the center of events, but at their edges, where attention is weakest, where silence is deepest. At first, nothing appears different. The world continues as it always has, balanced, unmoving in its larger shape, but beneath that surface, small adjustments begin to take place. Not visible in a single moment, but noticeable. When time is allowed to pass, there is a difference between what is seen and what is felt over time, and what is happening now belongs to the second kind. In the halls where ours moves, the atmosphere feels slightly altered, not in structure, not in design, but in presence. A stillness that once felt ordinary now feels more defined, as though the space itself has learned to hold silence differently. And in the gardens where Aphrodite passes, there is a similar shift, subtle, almost untraceable. The light feels softer in certain corners, the air feels slower in certain paths, as though the environment is quietly responding without being asked. It is not change that can be proven, not something that can be pointed to directly, but it is there, because when presence becomes repeated, when awareness lingers longer than before, it begins to leave impressions. Not on people alone, but on space itself. There are corridors that now feel slightly more still, courtyards that feel slightly more aware. As though the world is quietly adjusting to something it does not fully understand, and in that adjustment, subtle echoes begin to form, moments that resemble memory, without belonging to any specific event, a pause in a hallway where no one is present, yet something feels like it recently was, a shift in light across marble floors, that feels almost intentional. Though no intention exists, these are not signs, not omens, not declarations, they are simply traces, left behind by repetition, by awareness, by things that linger just long enough to be remembered by the space itself, and yet, none of this is acknowledged, not by those who move through these spaces, and not by those who unknowingly influence them. Because awareness, once it becomes subtle enough, stops being recognized as change, it becomes atmosphere, and atmosphere is easy to ignore, until it is not. There are moments now where stillness feels slightly different depending on where it is found, where silence carries a faint variation, as though it has been shaped by unseen hands, and though no one speaks of it, something within the structure of the world is beginning to align differently. Not toward chaos, not toward disruption, but toward awareness, because once presence leaves traces, those traces begin to accumulate, and accumulation is how change becomes irreversible. It does not need a moment of breaking. It only needs continuation, and continuation is already happening, quietly, naturally, without resistance, and so the world shifts, not in shape, but in feeling, becoming slightly more aware of itself, without understanding why, and in that quiet transformation, something is being prepared, not intentionally, not consciously, but inevitably. There is a difference between something being hidden and something being held back. Hidden things exist quietly, without awareness, but things that are held back are remembered, they remain present, even in silence, even in stillness, and over time, that presence begins to feel heavier, not because anything has changed outwardly, but because awareness has grown inwardly. What once was effortless now requires attention, what once was natural now requires restraint, and restraint always has a weight of its own. In the spaces where ours moves, that weight is subtle, not visible, not spoken, but present in the smallest decisions, a pause before entering a space, a moment of stillness before continuing forward, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to change the rhythm of being. And in the spaces where Aphrodite exists, the same weight appears in a different form, not as resistance, but as awareness, a gentle awareness of timing, of distance, of when to remain and when to move on. It is not fear, it is not hesitation, it is consideration, formed from something unspoken. Because secrecy is not only about hiding. It is about maintaining balance within what is known, and what is not allowed to become known, and balance requires effort, even when nothing appears to be happening. There are moments now where silence feels fuller than before. Not empty, not absent, but occupied by what is not being said, a shared understanding that exists without words, without confirmation, without acknowledgement, and that kind of understanding is never light. It sits quietly beneath every action, every movement, every pause. Like a thread that connects moments without revealing itself, and though it cannot be seen, it can be felt. There are spaces where both presences exist without overlap, not by avoidance, but by timing, by instinct, by something unspoken that guides movement away from coincidence. And yet, despite all of this careful separation, nothing disappears, it only transforms, from presence to awareness, from awareness to memory, from memory to something more difficult to define. Something that lingers even when nothing is happening, and that is where the weight becomes real, because what is not expressed does not leave, it stays, quietly, persistently, not as burden, not as relief, but as continuity, a continuity that cannot be interrupted without consequence, and so everything continues carefully, measured, controlled, not because it must be, but because it now feels necessary, and necessity is where secrecy becomes fragile, because the more something must be maintained, the more attention it requires, and attention is the first step toward visibility. Nothing has broken. Nothing has changed form, but something has begun to press inward, quietly, constantly, and even in silence. Pressure is still pressure. There is a stage in every hidden story where it is no longer only the participants who exist within it. At first, there is only the experience itself, unseen, unquestioned, but over time, something changes. The world around it begins to pay attention, not openly, not directly, but quietly, in ways that are almost impossible to name, because nothing that exists remains entirely without notice forever, and so the idea of observation begins to form, not as confrontation, not as discovery, but as awareness, watching without interrupting. In the spaces where ours moves, there are moments now where presence feels measured, not because anything has been revealed, but because something might be. The stillness is no longer just stillness, it feels inhabited, and in the softer spaces where Aphrodite exists, there is a similar sensation, not fear, not urgency, but the faint awareness that space is no longer entirely private. There are eyes that do not interfere, eyes that do not act, only observe, not with intention to change anything, but simply to understand what is unfolding. These observers do not speak, they do not reveal themselves, they exist in margins, in reflections, in distant movement at the edge of awareness. A figure passing through a distant corridor that does not belong to the moment, a shadow paused too long behind a column. A silence that feels slightly too structured to be empty. None of it confirms anything, and yet, it suggests everything, because observation does not require certainty, only attention, and attention has begun to gather, not around action, but around repetition, around patterns that are too consistent to ignore completely. There are spaces now where presence feels slightly heavier, not because anything new has appeared, but because something is being noticed more carefully than before. And that carefulness changes perception. What once felt like coincidence now feels like something that could be meaningful. What once felt like silence now feels like something being preserved, and preservation is its own form of recognition. But still, nothing is interrupted, nothing is exposed, because observation, in its quietest form, does not disturb what it watches, it only waits, and waiting is never passive. It accumulates understanding, it builds memory, it forms interpretation without declaration, and slowly, that interpretation begins to shape the world around it, not physically, but emotionally, atmospherically. As though the spaces themselves are becoming aware of being observed, and when a world becomes aware of observation, it begins to behave differently, not dramatically, not visibly, but subtly, carefully, as though even silence must now be aware of how it appears, and within this quiet transformation, something shifts again, because now, it is no longer only the participants who carry awareness, the world around them has begun to carry it too, and that changes everything, not immediately, not openly, but inevitably. There is a point in every quiet story where silence is no longer empty, it begins to fill, not with sound, but with interpretation, and interpretation is where things begin to change shape, because once something is observed, it is no longer only what it is, it becomes what others believe it might be, and that is where whispers begin, not loud, not direct, but soft enough to travel unnoticed, and persistent enough to spread. At first, they do not feel important, just fragments of thought shared between distance and hesitation, a passing remark, a glance that lingers too long in memory, a moment that seems slightly unusual when recalled later, nothing certain. Nothing confirmed, but enough to be repeated, and repetition is where meaning begins to form. In the spaces where ours exists, there is no awareness of these whispers, not directly, not clearly, but something changes in how space feels, as though neutrality is no longer fully intact, and in the softer spaces where Aphrodite moves, there is a similar shift, not disturbance, not reaction, but a faint awareness that perception is no longer singular. Whispers do not need truth. They only need repetition, and repetition begins quietly, in unseen corners, in distant conversations, in pauses that carry more meaning than spoken words. A story does not need to be fully formed to begin influencing how it is seen. And so, something begins to form around what was once only presence, not a clear narrative, not a defined understanding, but fragments, pieces of interpretation that do not align perfectly, yet still connect in suggestion, because the mind seeks patterns, even where none are confirmed. And where patterns are sought, meaning begins to grow, not from reality, but around it. There are now spaces where presence is no longer neutral, where being seen, even indirectly, begins to carry implication, and implication is more powerful than fact, because it does not need proof, only possibility, and possibility spreads easily, quietly, without resistance. It moves through silence, through observation, through memory, until what was once simple awareness becomes something interpreted, not accurately, not fully, but persistently, and even though nothing has changed in action, everything begins to feel slightly different, because perception, once altered, does not return easily to its original shape. It continues to expand, to shift, to gather weight, and in that expansion, the story begins to exist outside of its original moments. It becomes something carried, something discussed without certainty, something felt without understanding, and neither Ares nor Aphrodite acknowledges this directly, not yet, because whispers do not arrive where they begin, they arrive where they have already spread. And by the time they are noticed, they are no longer small, they are already part of the atmosphere. An atmosphere is difficult to remove. There are moments in every unfolding story when silence begins to feel different, not louder, not faster, but heavier, as if something unseen is gathering. Just beneath the surface of stillness, what once moved unnoticed now carries presence. What once existed without reflection now feels observed from multiple angles, and in that subtle shift, tension begins to grow, not as conflict, not as disruption, but as awareness becoming unavoidable. In the spaces where Ares moves, stillness is no longer neutral, it feels shaped, measured, as if even empty corridors now hold memory of presence more sharply than before. And in the quieter spaces where Aphrodite exists, the softness of atmosphere begins to carry a slight edge of awareness, not discomfort, but recognition that perception is no longer simple. There is no direct change between them, no visible escalation, no clear event that marks a turning point, and yet, everything feels closer to something undefined, because tension does not always come from action. Sometimes, it comes from accumulation, small moments that continue to return. Repeated awareness that does not fade as easily as before, a pause that lasts a fraction longer, a space that feels slightly more occupied even when empty, a silence that no longer feels completely neutral. These things do not announce themselves, but together, they begin to build something, not clarity, not resolution, but pressure, and pressure changes how even stillness is experienced. There are now moments where movement feels more deliberate than before, not forced, but conscious, as though even the simplest action now carries awareness of being seen, or almost seen, and that awareness does not remain isolated, it spreads, quietly, through thought, through perception, through interpretation, because when something becomes slightly more noticeable, everything connected to it begins to shift in response, not dramatically, but subtly. The world does not react openly, but it adjusts. Spaces feel more structured, silences feel more attentive, distances feel more defined, and none of this can be traced to a single cause, because tension like this does not come from one source, it comes from everything surrounding it, from repetition, from observation, from memory, from the growing awareness that something is no longer entirely invisible, and within that awareness, there is uncertainty, not fear. Not anticipation, but a quiet sense that stability is becoming less fixed than it once was, because once something begins to be felt, it does not return easily to being unfelt, it remains, it accumulates, it deepens, and even if nothing changes outwardly, everything begins to feel slightly closer to change, not because change has arrived, but because it is now. Imaginable, and imagination, is where tension begins to take form. Doubt does not always arrive loudly, it does not interrupt, it does not break silence. Sometimes, it enters quietly, as a change in how certainty feels. What once felt steady, now feels slightly less defined, not unstable, not broken, just less absolute, and that is enough to change everything inwardly. In the spaces where ours exists, there is a subtle shift in awareness, not confusion, not hesitation, but a moment where instinct is no longer entirely automatic, where thought arrives just slightly earlier than action, and that delay creates space, a space where something unfamiliar can be noticed, something that does not fit neatly into what has always been understood. And in that space, a question begins to form, not spoken, not defined, just present. In the quieter spaces where Aphrodite moves, a similar shift unfolds, not disruption, not emotional instability, but a soft recalibration of perception. Moments that once passed without reflection now linger just long enough to be felt, not deeply, but noticeably, and that noticing creates a subtle unfamiliarity. Because when something familiar begins to feel slightly different, the mind does not ignore it, it examines it, quietly, carefully. There is no external cause for this, no event that explains it, no visible change in the world around them. And yet, internally, something has shifted, not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to create awareness of possibility, and possibility is where doubt begins. There are moments now where stillness feels less complete than before, where silence carries a faint sense of unresolved thought, where presence feels slightly more reflective than automatic. These are not disruptions, they are adjustments. Subtle recalibrations of perception that do not demand attention, but quietly shape it anyway, and because they are subtle, they are not resisted, they are simply experienced. But experience, once altered, does not remain static, it continues to evolve, quietly, continuously, and within that evolution, something begins to loosen, not connection, not separation, but certainty, because certainty relies on consistency, and consistency has begun to feel less absolute than before. There is no rejection of what has been understood, no denial of what has occurred, only the faint recognition that not everything fits as cleanly as it once seemed, and that recognition is enough to change internal balance, because doubt does not destroy understanding, it softens it, it opens it, it makes space within it, and in that space, new awareness begins to form, not yet clarity, not yet direction, but something less fixed than before. Something that cannot be ignored, even in silence, and so the world continues, unchanged, unaware, but within it, certainty begins to loosen, quietly, carefully, and that alone is enough. There is a point in every quiet unfolding where simplicity begins to fade, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like light changing across stone. What once felt clear now begins to carry layers, not confusion, not chaos, but complexity, and complexity does not announce itself, it accumulates. In the spaces where ours exists, something begins to shift in how awareness is experienced, not in strength, not in control, but in what remains after thought has passed. A pause that lingers slightly longer than before, a reflection that does not dissolve immediately, not disruptive, but present, and in that presence, something unfamiliar begins to form, not an answer, not a conclusion, but a layering of perception that cannot be simplified anymore. And in the quieter spaces where Aphrodite moves, a similar transformation unfolds. Moments that once felt singular now feel like they contain more than one meaning, not contradiction, but depth, as if every quiet moment now carries multiple interpretations at once, and none of them fully cancel each other out. There is no conflict in this. Only expansion, of awareness, of feeling, of something that cannot yet be named properly, and that is what makes it complicated, because simplicity allows certainty, and certainty allows distance, but complexity removes the distance quietly. Without permission, without warning, there are now moments where presence feels heavier, not because anything has changed outwardly, but because internal understanding no longer feels singular. A glance that once meant nothing now carries possibility, a silence that once felt empty now feels layered, a moment of stillness now feels like it contains something unspoken within it. And none of this can be resolved easily, because nothing is actually broken, nothing is actually wrong, only expanded. An expansion does not move backward, it continues, quietly, irreversibly. There is no clear direction in this, no defined emotional path, only the growing awareness that feelings are no longer simple reflections of presence, they are becoming experiences of interpretation, and interpretation is never stable. It shifts depending on time, on distance, on memory, on awareness, and so what is felt is no longer fixed, it becomes fluid, subtle, layered, and within that fluidity, something begins to resist definition, not outwardly, not consciously, but internally, as if the mind itself is no longer willing to settle on one explanation, because none of them feel complete anymore. And that incompleteness is what makes everything more complicated than before, not because something new has arrived, but because nothing remains simple enough to ignore, and so the world continues, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in structure, but within it, everything begins to carry more meaning than it used to, and meaning, once expanded, does not shrink again easily. There comes a point in every unfolding story where interpretation is no longer enough, where meaning no longer sits comfortably on possibility alone, and something quieter begins to demand attention, reality, not dramatic reality, not sudden revelation, but the simple, steady presence of what is actually there, unchanged, unmoved, regardless of how it is perceived, in the spaces where ours exists. There is a growing awareness that perception and reality are no longer perfectly aligned, not in conflict, but in distance, a space opening between what is felt and what is actually present, and that space cannot be ignored forever, because reality does not require attention to continue existing. It simply continues, quietly, independently, and in the softer spaces where Aphrodite moves, a similar awareness begins to form, not resistance, not denial, but recognition that interpretation has been growing beyond what can be confirmed, and confirmation is something reality eventually demands. There are moments now where silence feels less like meaning, and more like absence, where presence feels less like connection, and more like distance shared in parallel, not everything that felt layered remains layered when viewed without interpretation. Some things become simple again, not because they were never complex, but because complexity was carried by perception. And perception is not reality. This distinction begins to settle quietly, not as disruption, but as clarity forming slowly through stillness, and clarity is never entirely comfortable when it arrives after uncertainty, because it removes the flexibility of interpretation, it narrows possibility, it defines edges again. There are now moments where what is seen and what is felt do not fully match. And that mismatch cannot remain unnoticed, not indefinitely, because the mind seeks alignment, even when it resists it, and so awareness begins to adjust itself, not toward denial, not toward acceptance, but toward understanding what is actually present, without addition, without reduction, without assumption, just presence, and in that presence, something subtle becomes clear. Not everything that felt significant exists in the same way when stripped of interpretation, and not everything that seems simple remains simple when observed closely. Reality does not erase meaning, but it redefines its boundaries, and boundaries change how everything is understood. There is no conflict in this moment. No confrontation, no resolution, only recognition that what has been unfolding has always existed alongside reality, not above it, not outside it, but within it, and now, that reality cannot be avoided anymore, not because it demands attention, but because awareness has reached it, and once reached, it cannot be unseen. After everything has been seen, after everything has been questioned, there remains something quieter, understanding, not sudden understanding, not absolute clarity, but something softer, something that forms slowly over time, a sense of what it all meant, when stripped of uncertainty, in the spaces where ours exists. Reflection does not arrive as explanation, it arrives as recognition, that what unfolded was never a single event, but a series of quiet continuations, moments that did not demand meaning, but naturally accumulated it, and in that accumulation, something became real in a way that did not require interpretation anymore, not defined, not resolved, but understood in silence. And in the quieter spaces where Aphrodite moves, there is a similar stillness, a reflection that does not seek answers, but acknowledges experience, because not everything that is meaningful needs to be explained to remain meaningful. Some things are only understood in how they change perception, not the world itself, but the way it was experienced, and that difference is what remains. There is no single conclusion that fits what occurred between them, no final definition that can hold every layer that was felt, because it was never one thing, never simple enough for one explanation. It existed as awareness, as restraint, as repetition, as possibility, as interpretation, and finally, as recognition of reality within it all, and each stage did not cancel the previous one, it added to it, layer upon layer, until what remained was something larger than any individual moment, not a story with a clear shape, but an experience that cannot be reduced without losing its meaning. And so what it meant is not found in conclusion, it is found in continuity, that something existed between awareness and reality, without fully belonging to either, and that existence changed how everything else was perceived. Not dramatically, not permanently in appearance, but quietly, in understanding, because meaning is not always created in resolution. Sometimes it is created in everything that came before it, and everything that followed it, and in that continuity, nothing is truly lost, it simply becomes part of what is remembered, not as certainty, not as interpretation, but as something that was experienced, and remains that way. There is a moment in every long story, when what was experienced begins to separate from what is remembered, not because one replaces the other, but because time begins to reshape how it is understood. What once unfolded quietly, in spaces of awareness, presence, and subtle tension, does not remain untouched by the passage of reflection. It becomes something else, not smaller, not less real, but more structured, more defined, more story-like, and that is how myths begin, not in their first telling, but in their distance from the moment they were lived, because when events are close, they are uncertain, they are layered, they are incomplete, but when they are far enough away, they begin to take shape, a shape that feels simpler than it once was, a shape that feels easier to hold, a shape that fits into language. And so what remains of Ares and Aphrodite is no longer just what was experienced, it becomes what can be told, and telling always changes something, because a story requires structure, a beginning, a middle, a sense of meaning that can be carried forward, but life rarely follows structure in the moment it happens. It moves in fragments, in silences, in repetitions that do not clearly resolve into shape, and yet, when those fragments are remembered together, they begin to resemble coherence, not perfect coherence, but enough to be recognized. And recognition is where myth begins to form. There are now versions of the story that exist outside the original experience, versions that speak of connection where there was only awareness, versions that speak of intention where there was only presence, versions that speak of certainty where there was only gradual understanding, not because they are false, but because they are simplified, and simplification is how memory survives. Because complexity does not travel easily, it fades in transit, it dissolves in repetition, it becomes reshaped by the need to be understood, and so the story of these two presences becomes something larger than what it was, not in accuracy, but in form. It becomes something spoken about in quiet interpretation, something considered in reflection, something placed within the structure of myth itself. Because myth is not only fiction, it is also interpretation that has survived long enough to become symbolic, and symbols do not need full accuracy to carry meaning, they only need resonance, and the resonance between these two figures, Ares and Aphrodite, becomes something that later minds cannot ignore. Not because of what definitively happened, but because of what it suggests, a union of forces that do not naturally align, war and love, strength and desire, conflict and attraction, not as contradiction, but as tension that refuses to fully resolve, and that tension is what becomes remembered, not the exact movements, not the precise moments, but the feeling of something existing between opposites without collapsing into either. And that feeling is powerful enough to become myth. But the myth is not the same as the lived experience, it is a reflection shaped by distance, by interpretation, by the need for meaning to be shared, and in that sharing, something essential is always left behind. The quietness, the uncertainty, the slow accumulation of awareness, these do not survive fully in myth, they become implied instead of experienced, suggested instead of felt, and yet, without them, the myth would not exist at all, because myths are built on what could not be fully explained in their time, not on clarity, but on lingering presence, and so the story of Ares and Aphrodite becomes something more than what occurred. It becomes a structure that holds contradiction, a narrative that preserves tension rather than resolves it. There are endings that arrive loudly, and there are endings that do not arrive at all, they simply become noticeable in hindsight. This story belongs to neither kind, because nothing about it ever truly behaved like a beginning, or a middle, or an end. It moved instead like something quieter, a gradual unfolding of awareness, a slow layering of perception, a continuous shift between what is seen and what is understood, and now, when everything has been followed to its furthest edge, there is no sudden conclusion waiting there, only stillness, not empty stillness, but full stillness, the kind that holds everything that came before it, without needing to repeat it. In the spaces once shaped by Ares, there is no longer movement that feels like question, only presence, settled, unresisting, and in the quiet light that once followed Aphrodite, there is no longer distance that feels uncertain, only continuity, soft, unbroken, nothing dramatic has changed, nothing has been resolved in the way stories often promise, instead, everything has simply arrived at understanding without announcement. Because not all stories are meant to conclude, some are meant to dissolve into awareness, and this one never fully belonged to structure in the first place. It existed in spaces between definitions, between observation and interpretation, between what was happening and what was being understood, and now that it has reached its quietest point, it does not collapse, it does not end, it settles, like light at the end of the day that does not disappear, but spreads softly across everything it touches. What remains is not a resolution between opposites, not a final alignment of forces, not a simplified truth. What remains is the recognition that complexity does not always require solving. It only requires witnessing, and once witnessed fully, it does not demand continuation. It becomes part of memory, part of understanding, part of what the mind carries forward without effort. There is no final moment of clarity that redefines everything, because clarity was never absent, it was simply unfolding slowly across time, and now it has finished unfolding, not into certainty, but into acceptance of what has been experienced. The story of Ares and Aphrodite, if it can still be called a story at all, does not end in separation or union. It ends in recognition that both were never fully separate to begin with, and never fully defined by union either. They existed in relation, in awareness, in the space created by perception itself, and that space does not disappear when attention moves on, it remains. Quietly, as all meaningful things do. Not demanding remembrance, not resisting forgetting, simply existing in the background of understanding, and perhaps that is why this ending feels so calm, not because nothing happened, but because everything that mattered has already been absorbed into the way it is now understood, and so there is no final revelation waiting here, no hidden truth left to uncover, no sudden twist that reframes everything. Only continuity that has become still enough to feel like silence, and in that silence, the story continues in a different form, not as events, not as interpretation, but as awareness, and awareness does not end, it simply changes where it rests, so when this story fades from attention, it does not disappear, it remains in the quiet background of thought, a suggestion of something once observed, something once considered, something once felt in passing, and never entirely lost, and perhaps that is all it was ever meant to be, not a tale with resolution, but a slow unfolding of perception itself, a reminder that even the quietest connections, even those that never fully become defined, still leave traces in the way we understand the world, and now, there is nothing more to follow, only the lingering sense that stories like this do not truly end, they simply become quieter than before, and in that quietness, they continue. Good night.